Imagine it's a blistering hot day in late 1970s Australia. The sun beats down mercilessly on a packed out crowd of sweaty rock fans who are stomping their feet in dirt and dust, going absolutely wild. The band on stage is AC/DC, and front and center stands a lean figure with tight jeans, tattoos half hidden by a vest, and a devilish grin. He grips the mic with complete confidence, like a man who believes he can conquer the world just by screaming into that microphone. He's Bon Scott, the raw-voiced vocalist who seems to channel every outlaw and misfit who's ever strutted onto a stage. There's something frenetic in his performance, a hint that he's burning through life too fast. But if you mention tomorrow, he'd probably shrug. Bon Scott, born Ronald Belford Scott, never cared for the caution signs. And for a while, it looked like that cavalier attitude was exactly what rock and roll needed, until it all came crashing down in the winter of 1980. He started life far from the Aussie beaches he'd eventually call home. On July 9th, 1947, in Forfar, Scotland, a baby boy was born to Charles Chick Belford Scott and Isabel Isa Cunningham. The Scotts were a family of nicknames. No one called his mother Isabel or his father Charles. It was always Isa and Chick, and that sense of playful irreverence seemed to weave its way into little Ronald's DNA. However, the warmth in the household was tempered by tragedy. An older brother, Sandy, had passed away not long before Ronald's birth, leaving a sorrowful gap in the family tree. Seeking a fresh start, Chick and Isa decided to move to Australia when their newborn was still small. Once they arrived, they discovered that Ronald was hardly the only kid in school with that name, and so his classmates dubbed him Bon in reference to Bonnie Scotland. That nickname stuck so well that even official documents often listed him as Bon Scott afterward. Early on, Bon's life was a wild swirl of restlessness and rebellion. By the age of 15, he'd had enough of school and dropped out, preferring the gritty reality of odd jobs over classrooms. It was also around this time that his frequent brushes with the law began. He was caught giving a false name to officers, allegedly stole a large canister of gasoline, and at some point was arrested for unlawful carnal knowledge, a stiff-sounding charge that fed into Bon's growing legend as a mischievous teen. Things reached a breaking point when a judge sentenced him to juvenile detention for a year. Those around him might have thought, this is it, this'll scare him straight. But in a twist of irony, detention only deepened his rebellious streak. On top of that, he picked up the guitar there. So once he was out, he wasn't any less stubborn. He just had more musical ambition. After his release, Bon tried his luck with the Australian Army, but if he thought the military might be a way out of trouble, that door slammed shut before it could even open. Officials rejected him as socially maladjusted, effectively telling him to go channel his energy somewhere else. Cue music. Bon began drifting around the local scene, hooking up with bands that rarely lasted more than a few gigs at a time. One of these was the Spectors, soon evolving into a bubblegum pop outfit called the Valentines. Bubblegum pop might sound worlds away from the guttural rock he'd eventually unleash with AC/DC, and indeed, Bon sometimes clashed with the other band members about what direction they should take. Tension built until the group imploded when the Valentines got busted for drug possession. Some members swore off their habit, but Bon took a different path. He publicly announced that Australia should just legalize marijuana. That didn't help his standing with the authorities, who already had an eye on him. As the Valentines collapsed, Bon meandered back into the realm of side gigs and random jobs. Eventually, he discovered a more fitting group called Fraternity in Adelaide. This band leaned away from bubblegum and more toward a style that suited Bon's raw, throaty vocals. Around the same time, Bon's personal life took a turn for the romantic when he met a local woman named Irene Thornton. the two started seeing each other, and before long Bon found himself with both a band he liked and a relationship that seemed stable. But that stability was always threatened by his restlessness. If gigs dried up for a few weeks, he'd break out into wilder partying. His friend Bruce Howe, one of fraternity's members, observed that Bon grew reckless whenever boredom struck. And boredom, for Bon Scott, was a lethal state of mind. That recklessness extended to the open road. Bon loved motorcycles. Maybe a little too much. Once, Bruce Howe rode on the back of Bon's bike and was horrified by how sharply Bon cut corners, leaning so far that Howe's boots were scraping the asphalt. Howe swore he'd never ride with Bon again and warned him to quit mixing speed and alcohol. But warnings only made Bon's eyes twinkle with even more defiance. In spite of the chaos, fraternity started making waves in the Australian music scene. They even snagged the top prize at something called Hoadley's Battle of the Sounds, an Aussie event that crowned rising bands. Winning came with $2,000 and, more importantly, a trip to Los Angeles to explore their big dreams. This should have been a triumphant moment, except Bon's shady past reared its head. Because of his criminal record, he was barred from entry into the United States. With Bon effectively blacklisted from the States, fraternity decided to pivot to the UK. They spent the prize money on flights, gear, and living accommodations for an entourage of about 20, including wives and girlfriends. But there was a snag. The band only paid the travel costs for spouses. Girlfriends were excluded. Bon and Irene faced a choice. Rather than leave her behind, Bon proposed they get married. It was a functional rather than fairy tale gesture, but it worked, and soon they were off to London as husband and wife. But the UK adventure was a slog. Fraternity's big dreams fizzled. They even brought their Australian tour bus, hoping to replicate their success abroad, but they found it near impossible to book decent-paying shows. Tensions mounted in the communal house they'd rented, and they were chewing through money with little to show for it. In the midst of the frustration, Bon took a trip back home to see his folks, after which he was supposed to fly back to London. That's when things got bizarre. Bon simply vanished. The band manager was expecting him at Heathrow, but waited in vain. For a full week, no word from Bon. His mother insisted she'd put him on the right plane. Then, out of nowhere, the band manager got a phone call. Bon was at the airport shirtless in the dead of winter, with zero recollection of how he'd spent the past several days. He mumbled something about following a woman off the plane in Bangkok, then blacking out. Even by Bon Scott standards, it was outlandish. Yet somehow he rejoined the band, who by then were in dire straits financially and morale-wise. Despite the gloom, Bon found time to refine his performance skills, training himself to be even more magnetic on stage. A bandmate coached him on how to face a camera, telling him to observe how TV news anchors exuded confidence. Bon latched onto these lessons, determined to stand out. In interviews, he'd claim his band was better than the Beatles or the Stones, or that they were rolling in money. It was all bluster. Fraternity was broke, and they were soon forced to rebrand themselves as Fang, a last-ditch effort to gain traction. It didn't work. They limped back to Australia, battered and disappointed. The meltdown took a toll on Bon's personal life. He and Irene decided to separate. Suddenly, Bon was a man alone, without a band, without a wife, drifting through menial jobs like working at a fertilizer plant. But even at his lowest, Bon's musical instincts survived. He joined the Mount Lofty Rangers in Adelaide, a casual setup that gave him space to toy with songwriting. He also picked up more guitar technique. Maybe if things had gone a little calmer, the Mount Lofty Rangers might have produced something interesting. But calm was never Bon's style. One fateful night, after some heavy drinking at rehearsal, Bon got into a heated shouting match with another member, stormed out, and roared off on his motorcycle. In the dark, his bike collided with a car driven by a man named Lee Morgan. Bon was hurled through Morgan's windshield, sustaining brutal injuries. Morgan later recalled that he'd grown up idolizing fraternity. To discover that the scruffy man bleeding through his windshield was the band's front man was a surreal gut punch. Bon's injuries were severe enough that he sued Morgan, winning $20,000 from the insurance. While that might seem like a windfall, nothing compensated for the physical ordeal. He spent 3 days in a coma, eventually racking up an 18-day hospital stay. Doctors treated a broken collarbone, lost teeth, deep neck lacerations, and the intangible trauma of nearly dying. Ironically, it was this accident, this brush with death, that would lead him to the biggest break of his life. Forced to stay in Adelaide while he recovered, Bon was still around when a younger group calling themselves AC/DC was on the lookout for a new singer. If Bon had been fully mobile or off chasing another scheme, he might have missed that opportunity entirely. Fortune sometimes lurks in the oddest places. AC/DC's founding members, brothers Angus and Malcolm Young, were trying to craft a raw, high-energy sound that combined glam stage antics with a rougher edge. At first, the band was uncertain about Bon, complaining that he was too old for their style. Bon, on the other hand, sneered that the band lacked maturity. Somehow, they all agreed on an all-night jam session, presumably to see who was right. By dawn, no one was complaining about age or maturity. Everyone realized that Bon's gravelly rasp and wild presence fit AC/DC perfectly. Another story claims that Bon showed up at one of their gigs, hopped on stage spontaneously when he noticed they lacked a singer, and blew them away. Or maybe he was driving their van as a chauffeur and decided to belt out a tune on a whim. Regardless of how it truly happened, AC/DC had found their frontman in Bon Scott. Their label reps, upon first glance, were shocked by his missing tooth, tattoos, and foul mouth, but they recognized that the audience would embrace him. So Bon was in. Once in the band, Bon wasted no time displaying the showmanship he'd sharpened. AC/DC was known for comedic stage gimmicks, like Angus wearing a schoolboy outfit. Bon soon matched that irreverence. On the Australian TV show Countdown, he turned up wearing a schoolgirl outfit, pigtails and all, to outdo the uniformed Angus. It was exactly the kind of rebellious spectacle the band wanted. They churned out their first Aussie album, High Voltage, 1975. But local success wasn't enough. They needed to crack the U.S. market. Another Aussie LP, TNT, included the now classic track It's a Long Way to the Top, If You Want to Rock and Roll, which famously featured bagpipes. The bagpipe idea was thrown at Bon because he once marched with a pipe band as a teen, but in truth, he could barely play. Rather than admit ignorance, he secretly taught himself enough to sound convincing. That dogged fake-it-till-you-make-it approach was classic Bon. Eventually, Atlantic Records took notice, and AC/DC compiled a U.S. release also titled High Voltage, merging key tracks from their Aussie albums. Critics were divided, but it sold millions in America. Suddenly, Bon's dream of making it overseas was becoming real. Yet the same rebellious attitude that drew fans also sparked controversies. In Australia, certain politicians and moral crusaders labeled AC/DC a negative influence on youth, especially after rumors spread that teenage fans were giving each other homemade tattoos with the letters AC/DC, risking infection. Bon and the band shrugged it off. Public outrage often just gave them more publicity. By the end of the 1970s, AC/DC was unstoppable. They recorded Highway to Hell in 1979, and it catapulted them even further. The album reached the top 20 in the U.S., which felt like a culmination of all Bon's sweat and swagger. If only it had been a happily ever after story. On February 18, 1980, Bon was in London. He spent the night partying at the Music Machine Club, indulging in a marathon of heavy drinking. His friend, Alistair Kinnear, offered Bon to crash in his car for the night, presumably to sleep off the booze. By morning, Kinnear found Bon unresponsive and rushed him to the hospital where doctors pronounced him dead. He was 33. The official cause was acute alcohol poisoning. Whispers circulated that something else might have been in his system. Some rumored that Kinnear was a dealer or that Bon might have mixed unknown substances, but no conclusive evidence emerged. Either way, the unstoppable rock front man had abruptly reached his final chapter. When the tragic news broke, AC/DC's Malcolm Young scrambled to contact Bon's family in Australia, fearing they'd see it on the news before getting an explanation. Bon's mother picked up the phone, at first assuming her son was calling to wish her a happy birthday. Instead, she heard the worst news imaginable. In an instant, everything changed for AC/DC. They considered disbanding out of respect, but Bon's family insisted that the group carry on. In the subsequent auditions, one name stood out: Brian Johnson, a singer from the band Geordie, whom Bon had once admired. Johnson stepped in, but the band made it clear that he wasn't replacing Bon Scott, merely filling the vacant spot. For years, they refused to play "It's a Long Way to the Top," one of Bon's signature tunes, as it felt like a betrayal of his memory. Nonetheless, their next album, Back in Black, which was dedicated to Bon, became one of the highest-selling rock albums of all time. In the decades following his death, Bon Scott achieved near-mythical status. The rebellious kid from Forfar, once deemed socially maladjusted by the Australian Army, was now revered by fans worldwide as the ultimate rock and roll frontman. His gravesite in Fremantle Cemetery became a pilgrimage spot, with thousands of devotees visiting, leaving tributes, and occasionally messing things up so badly that the site had to be designated a heritage location. Statues of him appeared in places like Kirriemuir, Scotland, the nearest town to his birthplace, and there's even an annual Bonfest there. Not all tributes end happily. In 2022, a 53-year-old festival goer at Bonfest lost his life. Authorities said there was no foul play, but the connection was eerie, an echo of Bon's fate as the guy who always skated near the edge. There are rumors that Bon had fathered more children than publicly acknowledged. One story claims that while recovering from an earlier overdose in a Melbourne hospital, he admitted to a manager that he'd once been in the maternity ward because two girlfriends had each just had his baby. If that's true, those kids never stepped forward, or if they did, their identities remain obscure. It all feeds into the rock and roll mystique. Bon lived fast, left behind pieces of himself scattered across the world, and never looked back. Yet the exact circumstances of Bon Scott's final night remain a matter of speculation. The official record says he drank himself into a fatal stupor. His mother, Isa, told reporters that he had a high tolerance for alcohol, so the news that he'd succumbed to it was both shocking and tragic. Some fans claim foul play, but no evidence has substantiated that. The fact is, whether it was purely from alcohol or from a combination of substances, Bon's lifestyle always danced on a razor's edge. What stands out most about Bon Scott isn't the way he died, but the energy he unleashed in his short, bright life. Listen to Highway to Hell, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, or TNT, and you'll hear the unfiltered, sometimes cheeky, sometimes menacing persona he brought to the microphone. He was a rowdy presence who reveled in adrenaline, who didn't let a year in juvie or a near-fatal motorcycle crash slow him down. He had this voice that was equal parts gravel and melody, perfectly complementing Angus Young's frenetic guitar. And behind that grin was a kid who never quite shook off the heartbreak of losing a brother and the label of socially maladjusted. Maybe that's why fans loved him. He didn't try to hide the rough edges or refine himself into a polished pop star. Bon was raw, and people responded to that authenticity. His death triggered a wave of tributes and homages. After AC/DC soared with Back in Black, dedicated to him, fans realized that Bon's spirit powered that triumph, urging them all to keep the music alive. Australia named streets after AC/DC. Perth, near his final resting place, recognized him as a cultural icon. Kirriemuir in Scotland, where it all began, created a statue to celebrate their hometown hero, forging a link between a small Scottish community and the roar of stadium rock. Meanwhile, the legend of Bon Scott only grew. People repeated wild tales of him blacking out in strange countries, of him ignoring the risk of jail, of him scrawling lyrics on the back of bar napkins. Newcomers discover Highway to Hell or Let There Be Rock and are stunned by the rawness of his voice. They see old footage, Bon shirtless, hair dripping with sweat, eyes blazing, and realize that no modern marketing machine could replicate that kind of authenticity. Brian Johnson, though an amazing frontman himself, was the first to acknowledge that the band was built on Bon's foundation. AC/DC's members always insisted that replacing him was impossible. They simply found someone who could carry on because that's what Bon himself would have wanted. His final day, spent in a haze of booze, remains a cautionary tale for those who romanticize the rock and roll lifestyle. Many fans believe that if he'd kept his indulgences in check, he might have continued with AC/DC for many more iconic albums. Or maybe he'd have eventually split off to form another epic group. No one knows. What we do know is that Bon Scott's story brims with close calls and leaps of faith. Some leaps carried him to stardom, while the final plunge ended in tragedy. His persona encapsulates the double-edged sword of living every moment as if tomorrow doesn't exist. Even so, the tragedy of his death tends to fade away when the first chords of TNT blare through the speakers, and that voice sneers, "Oi, oi, oi." Suddenly you feel that swagger, that rebellious spark. Bon Scott is alive again in those riffs and that unabashed attitude. The audience roars, and for a moment you can see him on stage with his battered microphone in hand, sweat gleaming on his torso, grin as wide as the horizon. He's unstoppable. He's the ultimate symbol of rock's potential for freedom and destruction, all swirling in one mesmerizing figure. And so maybe the real moral is that Bon Scott from Forfar, Scotland, who carried a juvenile record and a restlessness the army couldn't handle, found his destiny in the scorching lights of a stage. He burned hot and bright, an intense flare in the night sky of rock legends. Yes, it consumed him too soon, but for those who relish the notion of living fast and leaving a thunderous legacy, his life resonates like a power chord that never fully fades out. By refusing to compromise, Bon Scott changed the shape of hard rock forever. And while tomorrow finally did catch him, ending his story on a February morning in London, his influence endures in every raw-throated rock vocalist who hears that first AC/DC track and realizes that music can be more than just notes on a page. It can be a defiant scream of existence, a final stand against the ordinary. Bon might have lost his life in that fight, but in return he gained immortality as the man who gave rock a brash, unstoppable grin. And for countless fans, that is priceless.